Hurricane Sandy is more than 200 miles off. So where I'm standing right here could have an 11 and a half feet of additional water in New York Harbor.
Really this is going to be a very large storm.
Hurricane Sandy crashing on shore. Winds now at 90 miles per hour.
And then you start to
this is going to be a big storm. It's going to be a difficult storm.
If you're in your home or somewhere safe where you can remain, stay there. The time for relocation or evacuation is over.
This October, New York City will mark the 8th anniversary of Hurricane Sandy. In the years since the storm, the city has worked hard to avoid a repeat disaster. It's elevated homes and utilities, waterproof subway stations, returned neighborhoods to nature, and even constructed miles of temporary flood protection. In total, nearly $8 billion has been spent, but much of the city remains vulnerable. It's only a matter of time before the next storm comes. A transformational plan is needed. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers is currently exploring 5 different flood protection options for New York City, some of which incorporate massive barriers with movable gates. In one plan, 4 different structures would be placed throughout New York City, including a massive closable barrier between Staten Island and Brooklyn. As you can see, more studies are needed to determine the impact of such a big project. But you get the point. These megastructures could keep out the water. While this colossal plan might seem crazy to you, it's probably not if you're from the Netherlands. The Dutch have been winning the war against water for centuries. Ironically, it may very well be the Dutch who knew how to save the place they once called New Amsterdam. You just need to visit the Netherlands to see what a flood protection utopia looks like. Roughly 60% of the Dutch live below sea level. To keep the water out, they rely on an integrated system of dikes, dams, and pumps, called the Delta Works. Without it, much of the country would be underwater. The locals often joke, God created the earth and the Dutch created the Netherlands. Just outside the port city of Rotterdam lies the crown jewel of the Delta Works, the Maasland Flood Barrier, one of the largest man-made movable structures on Earth. The design of the Maasland is unique. Its floodgates remain open most days to allow ships to pass, but when a storm threatens, the Maasland closes. Each arm of the Maasland is roughly the size of the Eiffel Tower, and the walls on the end of each arm are nearly 70 feet tall, about the height of a 5-story building. While the Dutch certainly have impressive flood protection, New York City probably won't get its own Delta Works anytime soon. First, these projects are expensive. The price tag on what the Army Corps calls the middle ground option is over $40 billion. Second, such a big project could take more than a decade to construct. And third, the barriers could greatly change the natural environment within New York's waterways, most of which are currently approaching an ecological comeback. Concerns about the environmental impact of flood protection isn't new. In the 1960s, a proposal to build a series of barriers in Rhode Island failed, in part because local residents were concerned about worsening water pollution. And in the Netherlands, concerns about environmental impacts have also caused flood managers to re-evaluate their approach. In the 1970s, a public uprising forced engineers to redesign a massive flood barrier that would have closed off parts of the country from the sea. In place of concrete and steel barriers, nature-based strategies like oyster beds and marshland restoration have been favored by environmental groups as viable alternatives. But as you can see, it's not clear how well these solutions would hold up against massive storms like Sandy. Other experts believe that moving away from the water is the best long-term solution. But development along New York City's coastline is increasing. Since 2010, the value of property in low-lying areas has risen roughly 70%. But it gets worse. Unless you were born yesterday, you've probably heard that sea levels are rising. Indeed, over the past 120 years, sea levels in New York City have risen about a foot, but the rate is accelerating. In just the next 30 years, sea levels are likely to rise an additional 1 to 2 feet. This might not seem like much, but 1 to 2 feet of sea level rise will greatly increase the frequency of floods. By 2080, sea level rise will increase the frequency of the historical 100-year flood from once in 100 years to between once in 50 years to once in 10 years. 30 to 50 years is not that far away, especially if you're a city planner or real estate investor. Sea level rise will also expose more parts of the city to floods, including LaGuardia and Kennedy airports, where billions have recently been spent on renovations. Nearly 8 years later, memories of Hurricane Sandy may feel as distant as ever. But sea levels continue to rise, and we keep building things near the water. A lot remains to be done to prepare for the next storm. Any solution will take time to implement. Action needs to start now, whether massive flood barriers are part of the plan or not. Since I started this film, several events have put the possibility of flood protection further in doubt. In February 2020, the federal government abruptly suspended funding for the Army Corps projects in New York City. Then a pandemic emerged and put the government's attention elsewhere. But there's still reasons to be hopeful. For one, flood protection is largely a democratic process. Nothing gets done without public support. As the Rhode Island experience showed, elected officials are listening. Contact your elected official and tell them what you'd like to see implemented. Ultimately, New Yorkers must choose solutions from a menu of options, including doing nothing and just hoping everyone gets lucky. Each choice has their pros and cons. What the best course of action is somewhat subjective. Second, across the Atlantic, the Netherlands has shown the world what is possible when politicians, the public, and technical experts all work together to manage flood risks with sound engineering and planning. I said it before, and I'll say it again. It's only a matter of time before the next storm comes. It's up to New Yorkers to determine how ready their city will be.